Good evening. This crossroads, which consists of Brick Lane to the north, Wentworth Street to the west, Osborn Street to the south, and Old Montague Street to the east, occupies a central place in the Whitechapel Murders and their subset, the Jack the Ripper Murders. This shows where I am on the 1889 Booth poverty map. We can see a lot of very poor areas in the interior streets, the black and dark blue shaded areas where there was a concentration of lodging houses. The very poorest and shabbiest type of doss house where most of the victims of the Whitechapel murderers lived. The main roads are coloured red as these premises were occupied by more prosperous shopkeepers. I'll start with the northerly direction first, up here, down Brick Lane, and the murder of Emma Smith. Emma Smith was attacked on the early hours of the morning of Tuesday, the 3rd of April 1888, more or less on this exact spot, just up here. Monday the 2nd of April had been a bank holiday, Easter Monday in fact. Initially Emma survived the attack and died on the 4th. This account is based on what she told the doctor, who unsuccessfully treated her, and some women she knew at her lodging house. Emma was a local prostitute whose patch seems to have been in Limehouse, a couple of miles off in that direction. When she came home from her day's business, which was no doubt brisk as it had been a holiday, she was heckled by 3 or 4 men on Whitechapel Road. They followed her down Osborn Street and accosted and robbed her on this junction. They seemed to have pushed her into a yard here by what was Taylor's cocoa factory and brutally assaulted her opposite 10 Brick Lane, according to Inspector Edwin Reed of the local CID. They inserted a blunt instrument into her insides. She seems to have laid semi-conscious in the yard for a few hours before staggering off to her lodging house at 16 George Yard, probably via Thrall Street over there. At her lodging house, she was met by the keeper, Mary Russell, and another inmate called Annie Lee, who persuaded her to go to London Hospital. Quite a walk for someone so badly injured. She was seen there by Dr. Haslip. Emma had severe internal injuries. She lapsed into a coma and died at 9 a.m. the next morning, Wednesday the 4th of April. For Emma to have been a victim of Jack the Ripper, then either he carried out this attack as part of a gang, or perhaps she made the details of her story up to mask the fact that she'd been soliciting locally and she probably didn't expect to die and may have wanted to cover things up. Who knows? Now I'm going to discuss the westerly direction down Wentworth Street and the murder of Martha Tabram on the 7th of August 1888. Her body was found at about 4:45 a.m. on the landing at the first flight of stairs in George Yard buildings in a road that is now called Gunthorpe Street. It's the first road on the left down there. Someone who lived in the building had seen what was probably her dead body, but didn't realise what it was in the dark at about 3:30. Dr. Colleen, who examined the body, estimated the time of death as being at about 2:45 a.m. Colleen, incidentally, lived at 68 Brick Lane, just up there. Martha had been stabbed 39 times and had been left with her skirts up on display. Opposite George Yard, or Gunthorpe Street as it is now, was George Street, which I mentioned as that was where Emma Smith lived at number 18. By coincidence, Martha Tabram lived at number 19. These were both lodging houses, very cheap accommodation, what you'd now call flea pits. Further on from Gunthorpe Street, we come to Commercial Street, which can be seen down the end there, and just beyond is Castle Alley, where Alice Mackenzie was murdered on the 17th of July 1889, at some time soon after about 12:30 at night. She had suffered 2 cuts to the throat and several to the abdomen, and like Martha Tabram, she'd been left on display with her skirts up. The road beyond that, beyond Castle Alley, is Osborn Street, where we find Wentworth model dwellings. It was here at 2:55 a.m. on the 30th of September 1888, at the doorway of numbers 108 to 119, which is now the entrance to Happy Days Fish and Chip Shop, P.C. Long found a bloodied portion of Catherine Eddowes' apron under some recently scrawled graffiti that read, "The Jews are the men who will not be blamed for nothing." Catherine Eddowes' butchered body had been found at Mitre Square just over an hour earlier, a bit further on in that same direction where you can see the city built, the tall city skyscrapers. This was the night of the so-called double event, when Elizabeth Stride had also been murdered slightly earlier in Berner Street. Which way next? Well, yes, south down Osborn Street. We saw earlier on that Emma Smith came up here, according to her statement, pursued by a small gang of men. We'll move on from there in time to the first of the so-called canonical victims, Polly Nichols. On the night of the 30th of August 1888, Polly was drinking in this area, notably in the Frying Pan pub, which is at the corner of Thrall Street, which we saw earlier. It is now a curry restaurant, but it's the same building. She had been living at Wilmot's lodging house at 18 Thrall Street. She was drunk and spent all her earnings from prostitution on booze. The deputy of the lodging house turned her out, and Polly bragged that she would as soon have the money, the 4 pence, as she had a new bonnet, and she imagined that that made her look particularly attractive. At 2:30 a.m, now it's the 31st of August, Polly bumped into Emily Holland, the lodging house keeper for Wilmot's. They met just around the corner down there, opposite St Mary's Church, the church after which Whitechapel was named. It was bombed in the war and only the outer wall and a few gravestones remain. Emily had been watching 2 big fires which had broken out that night in the docks. Polly and Emily were friends, and Emily, as she was in charge of the lodging house, could swing it for Polly to stay there for nothing. She offered, but out of bravado, Polly refused. Emily reported that Polly was clearly drunk at that time. Polly walked off down Whitechapel Road in an easterly direction, looking for trade. And now, finally, we're going east down Old Montague Street. An hour and a quarter after she met Emily Holland down the end of Osborn Street, Polly's body was found on Durward Street, or Bucks Row as it then was, about half a mile in that direction. If you carry on down on Montague Street and go straight, you pretty much get to Whites Row, which led to Bucks Row. Whites Row and Bucks Row are now Durward Street. And Polly was found outside Brown's stable yard, just past the board school, where the rear entrance to Whitechapel Station is now. Emily Holland was the last known person to have seen her alive. If we'd walked down Old Montague Street, we'd have also found Whitechapel Mortuary on Eagle Passage, a few hundred yards down there on the right. That's where Polly's body was to be taken, along with the other Whitechapel victims. This axis, Bucks Row, Old Montague Street, Wentworth Street, was in my opinion the Ripper's superhighway. This route offered a discreet highway for him to slip off into the shadows. But I think he caught his victims on the main drags, the main road, Whitechapel High Street and Whitechapel Road, for example. For Lechmere, he could quietly go on his way down the road in the dark to his place of work in Pickford's at Broad Street, which was straight down here. Or, on the night of the double event, he could come back from Osborn Street, straight down here and home. When Lechmere met P.C. Mizzen, right down the end of Old Montague Street there, after he left the body of Polly Nichols, instead of walking in this direction to his workplace, he walked down Hanbury Street with Robert Paul, and of course the body of Annie Chapman was found on Hanbury Street about 100 yards from where he left Robert Paul on Hanbury Street. Now, the most obvious route for Lechmere to have taken when he met P.C. Mizzen would have been down on Montague Street, down Wentworth Street and straight to Pickford's. That's the most obvious and most direct route to work for him. But he didn't. I think there were several reasons. Partly he wanted to accompany Paul to whisper in his ear and find out where he was, where he worked, and partly because he didn't want to walk past the murder scene of Martha Taberham. He didn't want Mizzen to see him walking off in that direction, because it might have triggered a response in Mizzen's head then or afterwards. Now, these bodies had a horrible habit of cropping up on Lechmere's route to work. He'd always walk past these freshly slain bodies along and off the Ripper's superhighway. Anyway, please subscribe and share, and my apologies for those of you who've been waiting for another film. I hope you enjoy this one. Thank you very much.